Hi everyone, this is Debbie with Common Sense Landlording. Welcome back. Today we are going to talk about what to do with a tenant who always pays late. And this is not uncommon, unfortunately. Tenants, it seems like they do great and then all of a sudden they fall into this habit of just not paying on time. Sometimes they are chronically paying late, but it's like 4 or 5 times a year, or 2 or 3 times a year, or maybe it's only once. It doesn't really matter. Once they begin to pay late, it can become a problem. So these people, what will usually happen is they pay on time and then they're a day or two late, and then they're 5 or 6 days late, and they continue to get further and further out when they pay the rent. And some of them don't even pay rent till the end of the month or right before the beginning of the next month. It doesn't really matter how late they pay late, which is a problem. Sometimes they'll call and tell you. I've got one that calls me all the time that tells me she's going to be paying a little bit late. Other ones you just never hear from. And I hate that. I would rather they at least call me and tell me. They have common excuses. They were sick and didn't work. Maybe I want to call and tell me they took vacation for 2 weeks and they didn't go to work. Sometimes they're laid off. Occasionally there's something more serious like a car accident or a death in the family. I've had a couple tell me they were in jail, so they couldn't work when they were in jail. The excuses, some of them are very, very interesting. And it doesn't really matter what their excuses are, because every single time they pay late, it becomes an issue for you as a landlord. If you have a mortgage to pay, that's going to be a problem because you may not be able to pay your mortgage on time. And you're going to have other bills as well. What if your property taxes are due? Whatever the situation is. But it causes you a great deal of stress and uncertainty. And it, quite frankly, can be very, very annoying. It can cause you to not be able to pay your own bills. And quite frankly, the tenant is in breach of their own contract. Remember, they signed a lease that said that they would pay the rent on or before a certain date. And there are certain repercussions that are going to happen if they do not. You need to have a very set in stone procedure for dealing with these tenants, because if you don't, the tenant that paid a day or two late this month is going to say, well, landlord didn't do anything last month, so who cares? I'll just pay 5 or 6 days late, and then 2 weeks, and however long it gets. So it's very, very important to have a procedure in place. I mean, you can't force them to pay. At the end of the day, it would be great to be able to get out of, drive over there, get out of the car and go knock on the door and say, pay me right now. But realistically speaking, if the tenant doesn't have the money, then there's not a lot that you can do to force them to pay. What I'm going to tell you to do is to be sure that you have late fees listed in a lease and that you assess them every single month like clockwork. Sometimes they'll say, well, don't you trust me? I've always paid you in the past. And bottom line is, no, I don't trust you. I get lied to all the time, just about every day of the week. Tenants lied to me all the time. They just do. It's what they do. So don't trust any of them to tell you, yes, I'm going to pay you. So you don't have to send out the eviction letter. And quite frankly, that just is never going to happen with me. Be sure that you know the laws in your area so that you know what your legal recourse is. I always recommend that people that they consult with an eviction attorney. I'm not an attorney. I consult with my attorney, not every day, but it's not uncommon, once a month or every couple of months when something weird happens. I'll say, hey, just to be sure that we're on the same page, what can I do here? And then be sure that you send the appropriate notices out. So I live in Louisville, Kentucky, and here we send a 7-day letter. So my lease says what the process is. And that's very important to know what the process is for you and your tenant. So clearly state in your lease when that is due. In my case, they get a 5-day grace period. So rent is due on or before the 5th. And that's just how it is. So on the 7th day, the 6th day rather, I send out a 7-day notice that says basically pay or get out. Your lease also needs to detail what day the late fees start. So in my case, we charge $50 on the 6th and then $5 per day thereafter. And again, detail what the late fees are in the lease so that there's no question with your tenant when you start charging late fees. They see a $50 late fee and then they start getting additional late fees for every day. So again, $50 on the 6th for me, $5 a day until the rent is paid. So if they paid today and today is the 10th, I don't charge them on the 10th. I charge them the $50 plus the late fees for those days. And then you need to specify in writing in your lease when the eviction filing will actually start. So that way everybody's on the same page and there's no confusion as to when all of this is going to happen. Your late notice, when you send it, needs to inform the tenant, hey, you're late. Your rent was due on the 1st, because even if you have a grace period, keep in mind that rent is due on the 1st. And I've had tenants tell me, well, but I paid, I did pay. I don't care. Your lease states your rent is due on the 1st. You can legally send out a late notice on the 2nd. And I used to do that. And I've actually got tenants, when they start paying later and later, I start sending it out a little bit early. And I've had a couple of them call and yell at me, well, it's not late yet. Like, well, it actually is. It's due on the 1st. Even though you have a grace period, it's still due on the 1st. So don't let them bully you into that. Remind again the tenant on the notice when it's due. List again the late fees and list the date that they need to pay by in full before you start filing an eviction. They're all worried about an eviction filing, so use that to your advantage. And you need to instruct the tenant to contact you as soon as possible if they haven't already done so. And then have something else in there that says something like, if if the payment has already been sent, then please disregard this message. Many times this late notice will be the first time that you will hear from your tenant. The ones that don't call you, when you send your late notice, by golly, they usually will call you because they are going to be freaking out thinking that they're going to be evicted. And that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. So again, hopefully the goal is to get these people to contact you. I want to know why they're late. I need to know that. I mean, are we looking at a chronic issue? Have you lost your job? Did you just forget? Were you out of town and didn't bother to send your rent, or you didn't make arrangements? And many times they'll say, don't worry, we'll pay, we'll get caught up. A lot of times they'll ask you to forgive the late fees. And some of them are outraged that you actually sent them a late notice. I mean, after all, they paid on time all this time and they've only paid late occasionally, they always have excuses and they're just really dumbfounded when you have a process and you follow your process. And I tell people, and I'm going to tell you, this is a business. I like my tenants for the most part. Most of them are easy to deal with, but when you start having these people who think it's okay to pay late, they literally will call you up and try to coerce you into not charging late fees. I mean, they don't get it. If you are caught speeding on the expressway and someone pulls you over, you get a ticket. It's a financial penalty, a financial punishment for not paying online. And quite frankly, that's what a late fee is. If you can't pay your rent on time, the penalty is that you are charged a late fee for my inconvenience, for my stress. They're also in breach of a legally binding contract. So they need to remember that. Enforce the rules. And you need to stick to the terms of the lease. And when they start protesting, say, I'm sorry, but clause whatever the lease states. Tell them what it states. I look at this as a training exercise. And this is vitally important with your tenants. I don't care if they're brand new or they've been with you 20 years and they've always paid on time and they're just starting to have issues. They need to know that when they pay late, there is a repercussion. You're going to send a notice, a late notice. You're going to charge late fees and you will evict them if they don't pay the rent and the late fees. And I'm going to tell you to think twice before you forgive the late fees. I mean, as an occasional one-off thing, I can see that. But if you consistently remove the late fees or forgive the late fees, then you're not giving them any reason to pay on time. They need to have an incentive to pay on time. When you're always agreeing to forgive the late fees, then why should they bother to pay on time? Remember, you may like your tenants, but they aren't your friend. You need to have a separation. You shouldn't be going out to dinner with them. You shouldn't be, relaying fun experiences in your life, and you shouldn't be forgiving late fees. You are like their employer. And it's very hard to blur, when that line gets blurred, to enforce the rules. When they see you as their friend, that's a problem. They need to see you as their employer, as someone who can evict them at all times. And quite frankly, it is not your job to trust them. It's not your job to believe them. It's not your job to give them a chance. They need to pay the rent, bottom line. So when you have a tenant who is paying late, you need to talk to them, either meet with them, talk to them, somehow communicate with them, and figure out, can this person reasonably catch up? If they're just a little bit behind, it's easier. But the further behind a tenant gets on the rent, the harder it is for them to catch up. Most of these people live paycheck to paycheck. That's just the bottom line. Once they've lost a job, taken a vacation, been in jail, whatever the reason is, they've lost that income. It's not going to be recoverable. So unless they have someone who's willing to help them out, they get another job quickly, they have a credit card they can put it on, there's a really, really good chance that this person may not be able to catch up. But if you determine that they can, that there's a reasonable chance that this person's going to catch up, then it can oftentimes be cheaper to work with this tenant and allow them to stay in the house, stop the eviction, and to maybe work out a payment plan. Be careful that your payment plan doesn't stretch so far in the future that they lose sight of the fact that they really owe this money. I'm kind of loath to let it go more than 6 months. 2 or 3, 4 months is more reasonable. Oftentimes these people can borrow their money from family members. If you take credit cards, this is an excellent reason to take credit cards. It's not the most responsible way to pay your rent, but people need a place to live. And sometimes you need to be paid. So sometimes it is easier to have them pay with a credit card. I'm not telling you to pay your rent that way, but with tenants, at the end of the day, I want my money. Be prepared to move for an eviction if they fail to pay as agreed. So remember, this is a business. Everyone deserves a place to live, but they don't have to live with you. If these people cannot catch up on the rent, you're going to have to be prepared to move for an eviction. And the other side is that if they don't do what they say they're going to do, they tell you they're going to be able to pay the rent and then an extra $200 or $300, whatever the amount is extra every month, make sure they do that or terminate your agreement with them. So again, if this person cannot reasonably, in your opinion, catch up, then you just need to cut your losses. And many times I have met with several tenants and said, look, here's the financial reality. You owe X amount of dollars. You don't have a job, or maybe you've gotten a new job and it doesn't pay as much. Here's the reality. You're never going to be able to pay your rent and the utilities. I had one tenant in particular had childcare. Said, you can't pay all of this. You need to move. And she had the option of moving in with her mother. I convinced her to move out. She vacated quickly, left the place, in decent shape, and was able to get back on her feet. And she didn't like it. She didn't want to do it. She cried in my office, but she called me several months later and she thanked me. She said, look, that was the right thing to do. And she actually paid off her past due rent also. I did start a collection against her, but she voluntarily set up a payment arrangement and she actually paid the money. So sometimes it is worth the time and the emotional trouble to sit down with these people and try to convince them to move. Not everyone will, and I don't have any trust at this stage because they haven't been able to pay the rent. So I don't have any confidence that they will do what they say they're going to do. But when they don't move out, when they don't do what they say they're going to do, or sometimes they just say, I'm not moving, evict me. There's nothing you can do. You're going to have to get rid of me forcefully. I will go through the court process. Just don't take any more money from them, because once you do, you reset the clock on the eviction. So you can't take any money. And if this person, for example, owes you $4,000, I personally wouldn't accept $1,000. I would make them pay the majority of it or all of it, because otherwise you're just starting the cycle over. And then once they're out, turn them over to collections. On payment plans, again, use caution, meet with the tenant, sit down, go over their bills, their income, because it won't do you any good to set up a payment plan if they don't have the money. Every person needs a certain amount of money to live every month. Many times these people have no idea what their monthly bills are, what it costs them to live every month, and they will just blindly say, yeah, we'll set up a payment plan. So determine if it's workable. That is your job. Unfortunately, don't spread it out for very long. If you get into a situation where maybe they're getting a settlement or a tax refund, oftentimes that's a good way to get your money. But if it's June and they've already gotten a tax refund for the year, reasonably don't wait for the next year. Now, if you're in November or December and they can file early, like in January, I've had cases where I waited on my money and it was a good thing and they paid. So, but there's no guarantees these people will pay you. They could very likely get that money and go move somewhere else. So always keep that in mind. So your chronic late payer, you also have to assess, why is this person paying late? If it's someone who has had some sort of life-changing event, that's one thing. But you're also going to have those tenants who just are incapable of paying on time for whatever reason. I don't know why, but you charge late fees every month. They pay them. They don't. I've got tenants that don't complain. They pay late every month. They just pay the late fees and it's extra money to the company. So that is one way to look at this. You got two ways. You can look at it as there's extra money for you coming in to the company, or you can just decide that they are way too much trouble to deal with. And either way is okay. The extra money sometimes is nice, especially if this tenant has an established history of paying late, but paying the late fees. I'd leave them. I'd just say, who cares? You know, as long as they're not, you know, terribly late. But I mean, if they're paying $100, $150, $200 in late fees every month, well, you know, whatever, let them do it. They get too far behind, go ahead and evict them. One thing I will say is to improve your screening process so that you can hopefully identify these people in the screening process, the pre-screening and the screening process. It's very important to look at their payment history. Someone who has a bad credit score, which is why I have a credit score requirement. Someone who has that bad credit score has a bad history of paying their bills on time usually. Many times landlords are reluctant to give a bad review on a tenant for liability reasons, and sometimes they just want them gone. They don't want to deal with them, they want them gone. Be sure and do a post-mortem on these people. I always go back and say, you know, where did I mess up? How did I get this tenant? Did I properly screen them? Did I bend the rules? In which case, that's my fault. You know, did the tenant income, was it reported properly? Did I confirm it? I mean, I'm very set in my ways. I have a very strict process, but it's taken me years to get here. And not everyone does that. What I would say is learn from your mistakes. Up your screening guidelines. If you made an exception in this case, don't do it in the future, because you are now dealing with a tenant who is not paying the rent that you are most likely going to have to evict. And that's a problem for me. So review your screening process and try not to bend so many rules next time. Again, if this is an unexpected life change, there's not a lot that you can do about it. I have some landlords who have what I call a 3-strike rule or a 4-strike rule, whatever the strikes are. Basically, what that means is that once someone pays late for the 3rd time, or maybe you give them 3 times and on the 4th time, you won't accept their rent anymore. You've decided that they are so much trouble that you aren't going to keep them anymore. There are a lot of landlords here that do that. They give them an X amount of late pays and then they're evicted. They don't want to hear about it anymore. They'll give them a chance to move, but that's it. There's a limit on how many times they're allowed to pay late in a calendar month. So the flip side of that is that it does increase your turnover costs, because I mean, even with just paint and carpet, so to speak, it's money out of your pocket. So decide if you can afford to do that, but also decide if you can afford to keep the late paying tenant. So many times if you tell these people when they sign their lease, you have this policy, it will cause them to be more careful. And if you remind them, hey, you just paid late, you only have 2 more times to pay late before I evict you. Hey, this is your 2nd time, you know, you've got 1 more time, or the next time you pay late in this calendar year, you're going to be evicted. Many times that's enough to really scare them. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you just have to, you know, roll the dice and evict them. So remember, I'm always looking for a great tenant. I don't look for a mediocre tenant. I don't look for just any tenant. I don't want to deal with these problems. If you screen for a great tenant and then you enforce the rules, hopefully you won't have very many problems. And I will tell you, don't take the shortcuts when you're trying to find a new tenant. I was on a board over the weekend, and this tenant had several problems, or this landlord had several problems with their tenant. And I couldn't help myself. I said, what did the screening process look like? And she said, well, I didn't even bother to run credit. I wanted to say you have nothing to complain about, because this person, their credit report probably would have revealed that they didn't pay their bills on time. So please, 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 please run the credit, do the proper screening. Don't take these shortcuts, because they're just going to cause you problems down the road. It may take a little bit more time on the front end, but you know what? If these people are in a hair on fire urgency to move in, that's a big red flag in and of itself. And when you have your policies, please enforce them, because otherwise it doesn't do any good. If you have all these rules and you don't enforce them, these people are like, well, you know what? Why bother? You're teaching them that it's okay to break the rules. And when this person leaves you and moves on to the next landlord, you haven't taught them anything except that it's okay to not pay on time. The landlord's not going to do anything. They don't care. And that's always, always a problem. So do your job, because you do have a job. Your job as a landlord is to find a great tenant, and you do that by having screening policies and procedures and following them. And it is partly your job to teach these people to be great tenants. Bad landlords don't follow policies, and they end up with bad tenants. Good landlords have rules and regulations, they enforce them, and they properly screen their people for great tenants. So, sorry about that, bad slide there. You all can connect with me on my blog at commonsenselandlording.com. I'd like to hear from you. Have you had this situation? How did you handle it? We all handle things in a different way, and sometimes I learned something myself. So please be sure and check out my blog, commonsenselandlording.com. Leave your comments. Let me know what you think. Thanks for listening, and have a great day.